Inside the concrete labyrinth of California's most violent prisons, one name carried weight whispered only in fear: Richard Lloyd Terflinger. To correctional officers and inmates alike, he wasn't just another convict. He was a man whose reach extended beyond his cell door into the blood-stained hierarchy of the Aryan Brotherhood. By the late 1990s, Terflinger had risen to a level few ever reached, a confirmed high-ranking member, one of the elite few who shaped policy, decided life and death, and controlled the pulse of the Brotherhood's empire behind bars. The Aryan Brotherhood, often called the Brand, had evolved far beyond a racist prison clique. It had become a criminal machine, part protection racket, part mafia, and part death cult. Inside Pelican Bay State Prison, the Brotherhood maintained an iron grip on the white inmate population, orchestrating extortion, drug smuggling, and contract killings through coded messages and loyal foot soldiers. Within that volatile network, Terflinger was said to be part of a separate troika, three men whose decisions rippled through California's prison system. This troika, according to court filings, was the Brotherhood's inner council, the silent architects of the gang's most consequential moves. Born Richard Lloyd Terflinger, he was a man shaped by violence and hardened by the unforgiving world of incarceration. Though the public record offers few details about his early life, by the time he reached Pelican Bay, he had already been forged into a soldier for one of the most feared organizations in American prison history. He was intelligent, calculating, and absolutely ruthless. Inmates who encountered him described a man who carried himself with quiet authority, a figure who didn't need to raise his voice to command obedience. Terflinger's rise coincided with one of the Aryan Brotherhood's most turbulent eras. The 1990s saw California's prison system descend into open warfare between racial factions, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla family, and the Aryan Brotherhood, all vying for dominance. Each gang controlled specific yards, dictated economic activity, and enforced their codes through extreme violence. Amid this chaos, Terflinger emerged as one of the Brotherhood's most trusted strategists. According to informant testimony, he described himself as having acted as a hitman for the Brotherhood, a chilling admission that spoke to the price of entry into the gang's upper echelon. To become a member of the Aryan Brotherhood was not a symbolic gesture. It required blood, a killing sanctioned by the organization. Those who wanted to prove their loyalty were ordered to eliminate rivals, suspected informants, or even former allies who had fallen out of favor. Terflinger, by his own account, had paid that price in full. In the Brotherhood's deadly initiation rituals, he had earned his place the only way that mattered, through violence. By the early 2000s, federal investigators had begun to piece together the true scale of the Aryan Brotherhood's operations. Years of wiretaps, informant debriefings, and seized letters revealed a nationwide criminal enterprise run from inside maximum security prisons. In 2002, a sweeping federal indictment under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statute, named 40 Aryan Brotherhood members and associates. Among them was Richard Terflinger. The charges outlined a bloody empire, multiple murders, attempted murders, conspiracies, and plots to control the nation's most secure penitentiaries through terror. Prosecutors believed Terflinger played a central role in shaping the Brotherhood's internal politics and directing violence on behalf of its leadership. He wasn't merely a soldier following orders. He was one of the men giving them. As a member of the Pelican Bay Troika, Terflinger's word could determine who lived or died. For investigators, his name represented the deep-rooted power structure that had kept the Brotherhood alive through decades of crackdowns and betrayals. But even in a system that prided itself on control, men like Terflinger seemed untouchable. Isolated in Pelican Bay's infamous security housing unit, or SHU, he lived in near-total solitude, spending 23 hours a day locked in a concrete cell. Yet through letters, coded messages, and indirect communication, he and other Brotherhood leaders continued to conduct gang business, orchestrating violence and maintaining loyalty through a network of proxies and go-betweens. For law enforcement, the question was maddening. How could a man in isolation still wield so much power? By 2002, federal prosecutors decided to strike at the heart of the Brotherhood's leadership. The RICO indictment was meant to dismantle the gang once and for all, breaking its command structure and exposing the hidden hand behind decades of prison violence. Terflinger's inclusion on that list was proof of how deeply he was embedded in the Brotherhood's hierarchy. He wasn't a peripheral player. He was part of its nerve center. But the case that began as a bold strike soon became a legal and financial quagmire. The trials dragged on for years, consuming millions of dollars and countless hours of courtroom testimony. Jurors were sequestered for months, witnesses recanted, and some defendants were acquitted of the most serious charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office, exhausted by the scope and cost of the operation, eventually dropped charges against several defendants, including Richard Turflinger. To the public, the dismissal seemed like a failure of justice. To those inside the prison system, it was something more unsettling, proof that even the federal government could not easily break the Brotherhood's hold. Terflinger remained behind bars, serving a life sentence for a separate murder, his authority undiminished among the Brotherhood's ranks. By the time of his death in 2020, Richard Terflinger had spent decades within the closed world of maximum security incarceration. His life reflected the evolution of the Aryan Brotherhood itself, from a loose collection of white inmates seeking protection in the 1960s to a deadly organized crime syndicate commanding respect and fear across the country. Yet even as the years passed and prison conditions tightened, his name retained an almost mythical resonance among the Brotherhood's followers. For some, he was a legend, one of the few who had reached the inner circle. For others, he was a reminder of the gang's enduring darkness. A man who had chosen a path of blood, loyalty, and silence until the end. When the 2002 RICO indictment dropped, it was hailed as the most ambitious prosecution of a prison gang in American history. Federal agents and prosecutors had spent years assembling a case that stretched across the entire federal and state prison network. A web of murder, conspiracy, and organized crime that reached from California to the Midwest. At the center of it all were a few names whispered among inmates and investigators alike: Barry the Baron Mills, Tyler the Hulk Bingham, and the more elusive figures like Richard Lloyd Turflinger, one of the men quietly shaping policy from the shadows of Pelican Bay State Prison. The Aryan Brotherhood was not built like a typical street gang. It operated like a nation-state, a structured, bureaucratic, and deadly machine that governed through codes and silent orders. Each prison yard had its soldiers and enforcers, but the real authority rested with those in isolation. The Council of Three, or Troika, was the Brotherhood's supreme command within the California Department of Corrections, and Terflinger was identified by multiple sources as one of those three. This inner circle decided everything, from who lived and died, to how drugs and contraband would flow, to which prison yards would go to war. Behind thick walls and reinforced doors, Pelican Bay's security housing unit was supposed to be the end of communication. In theory, its concrete pods and small windowless cells were designed to strip inmates of all contact. But in practice, the Aryan Brotherhood had turned it into a war room. Messages were passed in code through lawyers, hidden in legal mail, or delivered by loyal runners, lower-ranking inmates who risked punishment or death to carry the gang's orders. Terflinger's reputation as one of the decision-makers in this system made him both respected and feared. One informant described him as the quiet one. While other Brotherhood figures projected raw aggression, Terflinger's influence came from calculation. He was known to analyze problems methodically, issuing orders that were rarely questioned. He didn't need to shout. His position did the talking. For years, prison intelligence units noted that his name appeared in connection with institutional disruptions, coded language for riots, coordinated attacks, or the killing of inmates who had crossed the Brotherhood's line. To federal investigators, the Brotherhood represented a paradox. Its members were locked in the nation's most secure facilities, yet they managed to orchestrate murders across multiple states. In one instance, investigators linked the gang to a nationwide drug ring operated through inmate networks, with profits laundered through associates on the outside. It was a system sustained by violence and loyalty, where silence was currency and betrayal meant certain death. Turflinger's inclusion in the 2002 RICO case symbolized the government's recognition of his role within this shadow empire. He was accused of taking part in the Brotherhood's larger criminal conspiracy, a plan that spanned decades and was responsible for at least 40 murders, both inside and outside prison walls. Prosecutors alleged that Terflinger and his co-defendants had worked together to maintain the Brotherhood's iron control over drug trade and racial dominance within California's prisons. Yet the case against him was far from straightforward. Years of secrecy and coded communication made direct evidence difficult to obtain. Witnesses were terrified to testify, and even those who agreed often recanted under pressure. In one chilling courtroom moment, a former Brotherhood member turned informant told jurors that testifying meant signing your own death warrant. As the trials unfolded, the magnitude of the Brotherhood's influence became clearer. Prosecutors presented intercepted letters or kites filled with cryptic instructions. They described how the gang's leaders, including Terflinger, approved green lights, orders to kill inmates accused of snitching or disobeying gang protocol. These messages were brief, often nothing more than a few words written in code, but they carried lethal consequences. The government hoped that convicting Terflinger and others under RICO would sever the head of the serpent. But the trials became a grinding battle of attrition. The defense teams argued that prosecutors were overreaching, that the government was using conspiracy laws to punish inmates merely for being associated with the Brotherhood. In some cases, juries were deadlocked or unwilling to impose the death penalty. After years of exhaustive litigation, the federal government made a controversial decision to dismiss the remaining charges against several defendants, including Richard Terflinger. For Terflinger, it was a legal victory, but not a freedom won. He remained in prison, serving a life sentence for murder, confined to administrative segregation because of his status as an Aryan Brotherhood leader. The charges had fallen away, but the label stuck. He was still classified as a high-level threat, an inmate whose influence made him too dangerous for the general population. Behind the razor wire and concrete walls, he returned to a life of isolation. Pelican Bay's SHU was a sterile world. No sunlight, no direct human contact, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of steel doors. Yet even from that tomb-like existence, Terflinger continued to be a name of consequence. To younger white inmates entering the system, he was a mythic figure, proof that the Brotherhood's hierarchy endured despite decades of federal assaults. To prison investigators, he was a reminder that leadership could persist even when communication was cut off. As years passed, the Brotherhood adapted to survive. The new generation of leaders learned from the old guard's mistakes, adopting tighter security, using coded language that even seasoned investigators struggled to decode. While other prison gangs fractured under pressure, the Aryan Brotherhood's core structure, built on absolute loyalty, violence, and silence, remained unbroken. Men like Terflinger had set that foundation decades earlier. By the 2000s, Terflinger's health had begun to decline. He had spent much of his adult life in confinement, a man aging inside a place that never changed. Yet the legend around his name continued to circulate. His inclusion among the so-called separate troika gave him a near mythical reputation, a councilman of death who helped shape an organization that could defy both time and the state. His story was not one of redemption. There were no public apologies, no appeals for forgiveness. Terflinger remained what he had always been, a soldier of the Aryan Brotherhood, a believer in its code, and a man who had chosen loyalty to the gang over life itself. When he died in 2020, his passing barely made a ripple outside the prison walls, but within that world, it marked the end of an era. By the late 2000s, Richard Lloyd Turflinger was no longer the fierce young man who had once carved out power in the chaos of California's prison yards. Age had slowed him, but his name still carried a certain reverence among those who understood the weight of the Aryan Brotherhood's history. To younger inmates, he represented a different era, a time when the Brotherhood's code was ironclad, its word law, and its authority unquestioned. To prison officials, he remained a security threat until his final breath, a man who could never be trusted among the general population. Decades of solitary confinement had taken their toll. Like many long-term residents of Pelican Bay's security housing unit, Terflinger lived in a world without color or motion. The isolation program was designed to break men, to cut off the channels of influence that leaders like him had used to dominate the prison system. But even as he aged behind the heavy steel doors of administrative segregation, Terflinger never renounced his allegiance. He had become part of the very mythology that sustained the Brotherhood's image, the belief that their leaders were unbending, unbroken, and immune to fear. Those who studied the gang saw him as a relic of the Brotherhood's second generation, a period defined by intelligence, structure, and calculated brutality. The first generation, men like Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham, had built the Brotherhood through violence and fear. The second generation, which included Terflinger, took that raw power and refined it into organization. They turned scattered acts of racial retaliation into a functional system of governance within the prison network. For nearly 3 decades, their authority kept the Brotherhood unified, while other prison gangs splintered under internal conflict or law enforcement pressure. Terflinger's own story mirrored the arc of the Brotherhood itself, the rise, the entrenchment, and the slow decline. As the years went on, the gang faced increasing isolation. The federal government continued to pursue key members through smaller, targeted prosecutions. Inmates who had once pledged silence began cooperating in exchange for reduced sentences or protection. The once feared communication networks that linked Pelican Bay to other prisons were systematically dismantled. Yet despite all of this, the Brotherhood remained leaner, quieter, and more secretive. Within this new reality, men like Terflinger became symbols rather than active participants. His very existence behind bars served as a reminder to both allies and enemies of what the Aryan Brotherhood stood for. His name appeared in debriefings and classified reports, his legacy tied to the belief that true power was maintained not through visible command, but through the aura of untouchability. For decades, his isolation had paradoxically made him larger than life. In the final years of his confinement, the prison system around him began to change. California's correctional institutions faced increasing scrutiny over the use of long-term solitary confinement. Lawsuits and public outcry led to policy shifts, and by 2015, many SHU inmates were being reintegrated into less restrictive environments. Yet for high-ranking members of violent prison gangs, men like Terflinger, there was no such leniency. His classification as a high-risk special threat ensured that he would die in segregation, the same way he had lived for much of his adult life. Little is known about his final months. Prison death notices are sterile documents: a date, a name, a location, and a cause. When Richard Lloyd Terflinger died in 2020, there were no public statements, no obituaries, no words of reflection. His death marked the quiet passing of one of the Brotherhood's last major figures, from the era when Pelican Bay's SHU was the command center of the gang's empire. For the outside world, his story had faded long before that moment. But inside, among the men who still carried the brand's cloverleaf tattoos, his name was remembered in hushed tones, one of the last of the old guard who had seen the Brotherhood through its deadliest years. Terflinger's legacy was complicated. To the Brotherhood's faithful, he was a model of loyalty, a man who endured decades of isolation without ever cooperating with authorities, without ever betraying the organization. To law enforcement and prison staff, he was a symbol of defiance, proof that ideology and loyalty could survive even the most inhumane conditions. And to historians of the prison system, he stood as a testament to the futility of simple punishment in breaking complex, organized power. The Aryan Brotherhood that Terflinger left behind was not the same organization he helped shape. It had become more fragmented, less visible, and far more cautious. But its core identity, built on race, violence, and brotherhood, still persisted. In every maximum security facility across America, the echoes of men like Terflinger still influenced how younger inmates viewed power and loyalty. His example had set a standard within that dark subculture, the belief that leadership was proven not through survival in freedom, but through domination in captivity. In death, as in life, Terflinger remained a paradox. He was both a victim of the prison system and its willing architect. His choices had ensured a lifetime of imprisonment, yet within that cage he had found status, control, and a distorted form of respect. His story challenges the very notion of rehabilitation, illustrating how in the closed ecosystem of prison politics, men like him could build kingdoms from confinement. As the years pass, the names of the old Brotherhood leaders fade into obscurity, replaced by new generations of inmates chasing the same illusion of power. But Richard Lloyd Terflinger's story endures in the annals of California's penal history, as one of the men who quietly ruled from the shadows, shaping the rhythm of violence that defined the state's prison culture for decades. When Richard Lloyd Terflinger's life ended in 2020, it marked more than the death of a man. It marked the slow fading of an era in American prison history. He was part of a generation that had learned to weaponize confinement, to transform isolation into strategy, and to turn a system designed for punishment into a staging ground for power. The Aryan Brotherhood's rise inside California's prisons was not just a story of violence, but a reflection of the prison system's own evolution, a system that produced men like Terflinger, then struggled to contain them. By the time of his death, the Brotherhood's presence in California had changed dramatically. The mass indictments of the early 2000s had decapitated parts of the organization, but not its spirit. What survived was an ideology of control, one that thrived in chaos, discipline, and racial loyalty. That mindset was passed down through generations of white inmates, many of whom never met men like Turflinger but knew their names from whispered stories and coded tattoos. In that sense, his legacy lived on not as a memory, but as doctrine. Prison investigators have long noted that the Brotherhood's most dangerous strength lies not in its size, but in its discipline. Every member knows the rules: loyalty unto death, silence before betrayal, obedience to the chain of command. Those principles were refined during Terflinger's time within the so-called Troika, when leadership was centralized and communication was precise. Even decades later, the structure he helped preserve continues to guide how the Brotherhood organizes itself behind bars. The lessons learned under his generation became institutional memory. Outside the prison walls, Terflinger's story holds a mirror to the system that shaped him. Pelican Bay and other supermax facilities were created to neutralize men like him, to isolate gang leaders, sever their communication, and dismantle their influence. Yet paradoxically, these same conditions hardened them into living symbols of defiance. Total isolation became a badge of honor within gang culture, a mark of status that proved one's loyalty and endurance. Terflinger, confined for years in the windowless cells of administrative segregation, came to embody that paradox. The system that tried to silence him only amplified his myth. The U.S. government's RICO prosecution of the Aryan Brotherhood was supposed to be the final chapter, a decisive strike that would erase the organization's leadership. But the aftermath revealed a more complex truth. Even as federal prosecutors celebrated convictions, the gang's ideology adapted. It became less visible, more encrypted, and increasingly decentralized. Younger members learned to operate in smaller cells, maintaining the Brotherhood's traditions without drawing the same level of federal attention. In this new age of criminal adaptation, the ghosts of men like Terflinger still lingered, not as active participants, but as blueprints. Within the closed world of prison sociology, Terflinger's case is often cited as evidence of how criminal organizations evolve under pressure. He was part of a generation that turned repression into structure, punishment into politics. The Brotherhood's command model, a small leadership corps managing a vast base through indirect communication, became a template later mirrored by other groups, including Latino and Black prison gangs seeking similar control. In that sense, Terflinger's influence extended far beyond his racial ideology. It shaped the very mechanics of organized power within America's correctional system. For law enforcement, the challenge became philosophical as much as tactical. How do you fight an organization that survives through loyalty and silence? The standard tools of justice, isolation, long sentences, indictments, seemed only to reinforce the mythology of men like Terflinger. Each time a leader was buried in segregation, he became a martyr to those who followed. The more the system tried to crush the Brotherhood, the more it proved the Brotherhood's warnings true. That loyalty must be absolute because the world outside their code would never show mercy. Inside the cells where he spent much of his life, Terflinger lived by a rigid belief system. That control and respect mattered more than life itself. His death in 2020 did not undo the culture he had helped build. In some ways, it strengthened it. His story circulated as a parable. That power in prison was not measured by freedom, but by fear. It was a lesson that continued to define the social order behind bars long after his passing. For prison officials, the legacy of Terflinger's generation forced a reckoning. The Supermax experiment, once hailed as the ultimate solution to prison gang violence, had revealed its flaws. Decades of solitary confinement produced psychological collapse in some inmates and deepened resolve in others. Studies began to show that isolation often made gang leaders more determined, not less. By the late 2010s, reforms began to take shape, reducing long-term segregation and emphasizing rehabilitation over endless confinement. But for men like Turflinger, those changes came too late. He remained one of the last men to experience the full weight of a system built on absolute control, and he carried it until his final day. The broader story of Richard Lloyd Turflinger is not one of redemption, but of reflection. His life exposes the unintended consequences of America's punitive approach to incarceration. In its effort to suppress the most violent inmates, the prison system inadvertently created a breeding ground for structure, loyalty, and ideology. The Aryan Brotherhood thrived in those conditions, turning punishment into organization.